My name is Margaret, and I'm 28 years old. After working a 12-hour shift at the hospital where I'm a registered nurse, I should have gone straight home to my apartment. Instead, I found myself driving to my parents' house for our weekly family dinner. I was exhausted, my scrub still smelled like disinfectant, and every muscle in my body ached. But I kept showing up week after week, hoping that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time they'd see me the way they saw my older brother Bruce. Looking back now, I realized that night would be the last family dinner I'd ever attend. What happened changed everything, and what I said in response shocked them into complete silence. Before I tell you what happened that night, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Trust me, you won't believe what I did next. I was born into what most people would call a typical middle-class family in Ohio. My father Frank, now 62, spent his entire career working at the local automotive plant. My mother Patricia, 59, worked as a secretary at a law firm downtown. On paper, we looked like the perfect American family. But the reality was much more complicated. My older brother Bruce, 31, was everything my parents ever wanted in a child. He graduated with honors from engineering school, landed a high-paying job at a tech company, married his college sweetheart Sandra, and they were already planning their second child. Bruce was the golden boy who could do no wrong. He was their pride and joy, their success story, their proof that they'd done something right as parents. Then there was me. From the time I was old enough to understand, I knew I was different. Not different in any objective way, but different in how my parents saw me. When Bruce brought home A's, they celebrated with his favorite dinner and bragging calls to relatives. When I brought home A's, they nodded and asked why I couldn't be more like Bruce in other areas too. The pattern started early and never stopped. When I turned 16, my parents forgot my birthday entirely. They were too busy helping Bruce prepare for a football scholarship interview. I spent that day alone in my room, waiting for someone to remember. No one did. But 2 weeks later, when Bruce scored the winning touchdown in his homecoming game, they threw him a surprise party that lasted until midnight. My high school graduation was on the same day as one of Bruce's college football games 3 hours away. My parents chose to drive to his game instead of watching me walk across the stage. I sat in the audience searching the crowd for their faces, but found only empty seats where they should have been. Later they explained that Bruce's game was more important because it might lead to professional opportunities. When I graduated nursing school with honors, they did attend the ceremony. But throughout the entire event they complained loudly about Bruce not being able to make it due to a work conference. During my graduation dinner, they spent 45 minutes on speakerphone with Bruce discussing his latest promotion, while my diploma sat forgotten on the table. Despite all of this, I never stopped trying. I called them every Sunday morning religiously. I attended every family gathering, even when I had to switch shifts at the hospital. I remembered their birthdays, their anniversary, and every holiday with carefully chosen gifts. I helped them set up their new television, taught my mother how to use her smartphone, and explained my father's medication schedule to him after his minor heart episode 2 years ago. I genuinely loved my job at the emergency department. There's something powerful about being there during someone's worst moment and helping them through it. I'd held the hands of scared children, comforted grieving families, and celebrated with patients who recovered against all odds. My colleagues respected me. My supervisor had recommended me for a leadership program, and I'd recently been recognized for saving a man's life during a particularly complicated cardiac arrest. But none of that seemed to matter when I walked through my parents' front door each week. In their eyes, I was still the disappointment, the child who chose a safe career instead of something ambitious like Bruce. They saw my nursing degree as settling for less, even though I'd found genuine purpose in healing others. That Tuesday evening started like every other family dinner. I'd just finished a particularly brutal shift in the emergency room. We'd treated 2 car accident victims, an elderly woman with pneumonia, and a teenager who'd overdosed on his mother's prescription pills. I was emotionally drained and physically exhausted, but I still stopped at the grocery store on my way to my parents' house. I picked up a bottle of their favorite wine, some fresh flowers for the dining room table, and a chocolate cake from the bakery section. It was the same routine I'd followed for years, always arriving with something to contribute, always hoping it would somehow earn me the warmth they showed Bruce. When I pulled into the driveway of the two-story house where I'd grown up, I noticed Bruce's silver SUV and Sandra's white sedan already parked there. The familiar pang of anxiety hit my stomach. Family dinners were always harder when Bruce and Sandra were there because it meant I'd spend the evening watching my parents dote on them while barely acknowledging my presence. I walked up the familiar brick pathway past the rose bushes my mother tended so carefully and knocked on the front door. My father opened it with a neutral expression that immediately shifted to a genuine smile when he saw the wine in my hand. "Oh, good you brought wine," he said, taking the bottle without looking at me. "Bruce was just telling us about his promotion opportunity." That was it. No, "how was work?" or "you look tired." Just appreciation for the wine and immediate redirection to Bruce's accomplishments. I followed him into the living room where my mother was arranging appetizers on the coffee table, while Bruce and Sandra sat comfortably on the couch, looking relaxed and happy. "Hi, everyone," I said, setting the flowers on the side table and placing the cake box on the kitchen counter. "Margaret," my mother said, without looking up from the cheese platter. "You're late." I glanced at the clock. I was exactly 3 minutes past 7, the time we'd agreed on. But Bruce and Sandra had clearly arrived earlier, and in my mother's mind that made me late. "Sorry, I stopped to pick up dessert," I explained, but she'd already turned back to Bruce, asking him about his latest project at work. I sat down in the armchair across from the couch, the same seat I'd occupied at every family gathering for the past 10 years. It was positioned slightly outside the main conversation circle, which seemed fitting given my role in this family. Bruce launched into a detailed explanation of his new role overseeing a team of junior engineers. His company was developing software for electric vehicle batteries, and he spoke with the confidence of someone who knew his audience was hanging on every word. My parents leaned forward, asking thoughtful questions and making impressed comments. "The salary increase is substantial," Bruce said, glancing at Sandra with a proud smile. "We're looking at houses in Riverside Estates now." "Oh, that's wonderful," my mother exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "Those are beautiful homes. Remember when we drove through there last Christmas, Frank?" I said those were the kind of houses successful people live in. My father nodded enthusiastically. "You've really made something of yourself, son. We're proud of you." The conversation continued in this vein for 20 minutes. Sandra shared news about their attempts to get pregnant with their second child. My parents responded with excitement and offers to help with anything they might need. They discussed vacation plans, home renovations, and Bruce's potential for climbing even higher in his company. I tried several times to join the conversation. When they mentioned electric vehicles, I brought up the training I'd recently completed on treating electrical burn injuries, thinking it might be relevant. No one responded. When they discussed the challenges of pregnancy, I offered to share some resources about prenatal nutrition that I'd learned about through my work with expecting mothers in the emergency room. My mother waved me off, saying Sandra's doctor would handle all of that. Finally, as we moved to the dining room for dinner, I decided to share something significant that had happened at work. The previous week, I'd been part of a team that saved a 55-year-old man who'd suffered a massive heart attack in our waiting room. It had been touch and go for 40 minutes, but we'd managed to stabilize him and get him to surgery. He'd sent a thank you card to our department specifically mentioning my quick thinking in recognizing the signs of his deteriorating condition. "That must have been terrifying for his family," Sandra said politely, but I could tell she was just being nice. "It was," I agreed, "but it's moments like those that remind me why I love being a nurse. When you can literally save someone's life, it makes all the difficult days worth it." "That's nice, dear," my mother said in the same tone she might use to acknowledge a child's finger painting. "Bruce, tell us more about this training program your company is sending you to in California. And just like that, my moment was over. The conversation flowed back to Bruce's opportunities, Bruce's success, Bruce's bright future. I sat there eating my mother's pot roast, feeling invisible in my own family. As dinner progressed, the familiar dynamics became even more pronounced. My mother had prepared all of Bruce's favorite dishes pot roast with her special gravy mashed potatoes made with extra butter, green bean casserole with the crispy onions on top, and fresh dinner rolls that she'd started making at 5 in the morning. She hadn't asked what I might want, and she'd included Brussels sprouts, which she knew I disliked, but Bruce loved. The conversation topics continued to revolve around Bruce and Sandra's life plans. They discussed their timeline for having children, their ideas for renovating their current house before they moved, and Sandra's plan to reduce her work hours once they had a second baby. "It's so smart that you two are planning everything so carefully," my father said, cutting another piece of pot roast. "That's what successful couples do. They make strategic decisions. Unlike some people who just drift through life without any real goals," my mother added. And although she didn't look at me, the implication was clear. I felt my jaw tighten. "I have goals," I said quietly. "I'm actually being considered for a charge nurse position, which would mean leading an entire shift in the emergency department." "That's nice," my father said dismissively. "But it's not really a career path with upward mobility, is it? I mean, you'll still just be a nurse." The phrase, "just a nurse," hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent 4 years in college, passed a rigorous licensing exam, and worked in one of the most demanding departments in healthcare. I'd saved lives, comforted families during their worst moments, and continued my education with specialized certifications. But to my father, I was just a nurse. "Nursing is a respected profession," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're an essential part of the healthcare system." "Of course, dear," my mother said in that patronizing tone. "It's a fine job for women who want something stable, but Bruce is building something bigger. He's going to be managing entire teams making decisions that affect thousands of people." Sandra, who had been quiet during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Actually, Margaret, maybe you should think about going back to school. You could become a nurse practitioner or even a doctor. You're smart enough." Her words were meant to be encouraging, but they stung because they implied that what I was doing now wasn't enough. Everyone at this table believed that my current life and career were somehow insufficient, that I needed to become something else to have value. "I love being a bedside nurse," I said firmly. "I like taking care of patients directly. Not everyone needs to be in management or have an advanced degree to make a difference." "But don't you want more for yourself?" Bruce asked. And for the first time he seemed genuinely concerned rather than dismissive. "I mean, you're capable of so much more than emptying bedpans and giving shots." His characterization of my job was so reductive and insulting that I felt my face flush with anger. "That's not what nursing is," I said, my voice rising slightly. "I perform complex assessments, manage life support equipment, administer medications that require precise calculations, and make split-second decisions that can mean the difference between life and death." Okay, my father said, holding up his hands. "Let's not get emotional about this. We're just saying that maybe you should aim higher." "Like Bruce has," my mother added. "He's always been ambitious. Even in high school he had plans. Remember how he mapped out his entire college and career path junior year?" They were off and running again, reminiscing about Bruce's early signs of success, his leadership qualities, his natural ability to excel at everything he touched. I sat there listening to them rewrite history, making Bruce sound like he'd been a child prodigy when the truth was much more ordinary. What they conveniently forgot was that I'd had plans too. I'd known I wanted to be a nurse since I was 12 years old, after spending a week in the hospital with pneumonia. The nurses who cared for me had been kind, competent, and reassuring during a scary time. I decided then that I wanted to be that source of comfort for other people. I'd volunteered at the hospital throughout high school, maintained a high GPA, and worked part-time jobs to save money for college. I'd been accepted to 3 different nursing programs and chosen the one with the best clinical training opportunities. I'd graduated magna cum laude and passed my licensing exam on the first try. But none of that counted as having plans in my parents' eyes. The thing is, my father continued apparently warming to his theme. Bruce has always thought strategically about his future. He chose engineering because he knew it would be lucrative and stable. He picked a company with growth potential. He married Sandra because she's from a good family and shares his values. I looked at Sandra, wondering how she felt about being described as a strategic choice rather than a love match, but she seemed pleased by the compliment. And now they're planning their family expansion at exactly the right time, my mother added. They've established their careers, bought a house, built up savings. Everything in the proper order. The implication was clear, unlike me, who at 28 was still single, renting an apartment and working in a job they considered beneath my potential. Never mind that I was financially independent, happy with my career choice, and had deliberately focused on building my professional skills before committing to a relationship. Some people, my mother continued, just don't seem to have that kind of foresight. The breaking point came when the conversation shifted to future family responsibilities. Sandra had just finished describing their house hunting process when Bruce made an offhand comment that changed everything. You know, we should probably start thinking about long-term plans for you two as well, Bruce said, gesturing toward our parents. I mean, you're both in your 60s now. At some point, you might need help with things. My mother smiled fondly at him. Oh, Bruce, always thinking ahead. That's why we're so grateful to have you. Well, someone has to be responsible, my father said, shooting a meaningful glance in my direction. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What do you mean by that? Just that Bruce has his life together, my mother explained. He has a stable career, a good marriage, financial security. If something happened to us, we know we could count on him. Whereas some people, my father added, are still figuring out their lives at almost 30 years old. The unfairness of this assessment hit me like a slap. I was the one with medical training. I was the one who lived closest to them. I was the one who had helped my father understand his medications, who had taught my mother how to monitor her blood pressure, who had advocated for them during their various medical appointments over the years. I'm a registered nurse, I said, my voice tight with suppressed anger. I probably know more about healthcare and aging than anyone at this table. If you needed care, I'd be the logical choice to help coordinate it. But you work such crazy hours, Sandra pointed out. How would you have time to take care of anyone else? And you're not married, my mother added. You don't have the stability that comes with a solid partnership like Bruce and Sandra have. Being married doesn't automatically make someone more capable of caregiving, I replied. And my schedule is flexible. I could arrange my shifts around any care needs you might have. My father laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. Margaret, you can barely manage your own life. You're still renting that tiny apartment, you don't have any savings to speak of, and you've never even had a serious relationship. Each word was like a knife. The apartment I rented was small, but it was in a safe neighborhood close to the hospital, and I'd furnished it carefully with pieces I loved. I did have savings, they just weren't as substantial as Bruce's because nurses don't earn engineering salaries. And my relationship history was my own business, not a measure of my worth as a person. You know what your problem is, my mother said, and her voice carried a tone of finality that made everyone at the table pay attention. You've never learned to think beyond yourself. Bruce understands family responsibility. He makes decisions based on what's best for everyone, not just what he wants in the moment. That's not fair, I said, my voice shaking slightly. I've been thinking about this family for years. I'm the one who calls you every week. I'm the one who comes to every dinner, every holiday, every family event. I'm the one who helped Dad figure out his insurance when he was confused about the changes at work. Those are just small things, my father dismissed. We're talking about real responsibility, long-term planning, the kind of thinking that requires maturity. I stared at him in disbelief. Small things. When you had chest pains last year, who drove you to the emergency room at 2 in the morning, when Mom fell and hurt her wrist, who stayed with her for 6 hours until you got home from your fishing trip. Anyone would have done that, my mother said with a wave of her hand. We're talking about bigger picture issues. Bruce understands what it means to be dependable. Plus, Sandra added, apparently feeling emboldened to join the criticism, Bruce has always been there for you both emotionally. He calls to check in, he visits regularly, he includes you in his life decisions. Margaret tends to be more distant. I felt like I was living in an alternate reality. I was the one who called every Sunday. I was the one who showed up for dinners even when I was exhausted from work. I was the one who remembered their preferences, their medical appointments, their concerns. But somehow in their minds, Bruce was the attentive child, and I was the distant one. I think Margaret has always been a little selfish, my mother continued as if I weren't sitting right there. Even as a child, she was more focused on her own interests than on what the family needed. That's not true, I protested, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. Remember when she wanted to go to that summer camp instead of helping with Grandma's move? My father asked. Or when she chose to work during Bruce's graduation party. I remembered both of those incidents very differently. The summer camp had been a program for students interested in healthcare careers, and I'd saved my own money to pay for it. But they'd wanted me to help pack up my grandmother's house during the same week. I'd offered to help before or after the camp, but they'd insisted it had to be that specific week. As for Bruce's graduation party, I'd been scheduled to work a double shift at the hospital where I'd just started as a new nurse. I'd tried to switch with someone, but it was my first month on the job and I couldn't find anyone to cover for me. I'd explained this to my parents, but they'd acted like I'd chosen work over family out of spite. You see, my mother said, as if those examples proved her point. Margaret has always put herself first. Bruce would have found a way to be there for family. The conversation continued in this vein for another 10 minutes with my parents and Sandra, listing all the ways Bruce was superior to me, all the evidence of my selfishness and lack of commitment to family. With each criticism, I felt smaller and more invisible. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Do you realize what you're doing right now? I asked, my voice rising. You're sitting here talking about me like I'm not even present. You're criticizing everything about my life and my choices, and you're doing it right in front of me. We're trying to help you understand why you need to make some changes, my father said sternly. Sometimes people need to hear hard truths. These aren't hard truths, I shot back. These are unfair characterizations based on your preference for Bruce over me. The words hung in the air for a moment, and I saw my parents exchange a glance. Then my mother's face hardened. That's exactly the kind of thing we're talking about, she said coldly. Always playing the victim. Always making everything about you. I'm not playing the victim, I said desperately. I'm pointing out that you treat Bruce and me completely differently, and you have since we were children. Maybe, my father said slowly, that's because Bruce has given us more reasons to be proud. The final explosion came so suddenly that it caught everyone off guard, including me. One moment we were having what my parents probably thought was a constructive conversation about my life choices, and the next moment everything fell apart. You know what? I said, standing up from my chair so abruptly that it scraped against the hardwood floor. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of coming here every week just to be criticized and compared to Bruce. I'm tired of pretending that this is normal family behavior. Sit down, Margaret, my father commanded in the same tone he'd used when I was 7 years old. You're being dramatic. No, I'm not being dramatic. I'm being honest for the first time in years. My voice was shaking, but I pressed on. Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up knowing that nothing you do will ever be good enough? Do you know what it's like to watch your parents' faces light up when your brother walks into a room, knowing that you've never seen that same expression directed at you? That's not true, my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. It is true, and you know it. When I graduated nursing school, you spent my celebration dinner talking to Bruce on the phone about his job. When I got my first promotion, you barely acknowledged it. When I bought my first car with money I'd saved myself, you criticized me for not getting a more practical model. We've always supported your choices, my father insisted, but his tone was defensive now. Supported them? You just spent the last hour explaining why every choice I've made has been wrong. You've told me my career isn't ambitious enough. My living situation isn't stable enough. My relationship status isn't committed enough. What exactly have you supported? Sandra shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly wishing she could disappear. Bruce looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Margaret, you're overreacting, my mother said, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. Am I really? Because right now you're dismissing my feelings, just like you've dismissed everything else about me for the past 28 years. I started pacing behind my chair, the words pouring out of me like water through a broken dam. Do you want to know what I do at work? I save lives. Literally. Last week, I helped resuscitate a man who had been dead for 4 minutes. 4 minutes. His heart had stopped, and we brought him back. His wife hugged me and cried and said I was an angel. My voice cracked slightly, but I continued. I've held the hands of dying patients so they wouldn't be alone. I've taught new mothers how to breastfeed. I've comforted children who were afraid of getting shots. I've worked 16-hour days during flu outbreaks, and I've stayed late to make sure confused elderly patients understood their discharge instructions. We know you work hard, my mother said quietly, but you don't think it matters. You think I'm just a nurse who should aim higher. You think my job is emptying bedpans and giving shots. You have no idea what I actually do, and you've never bothered to learn. My father cleared his throat. Margaret, we appreciate that you help people, but it's not as impressive as Bruce's job. Nothing I do is as impressive as what Bruce does. I could cure cancer, and you'd probably ask why I didn't also solve world hunger while I was at it. That's enough, my father said sharply. You're being disrespectful. Disrespectful, I'm being honest. There's a difference. The room fell silent, except for the sound of my heavy breathing. Everyone was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. In their minds, I was having an irrational outburst. In my mind, I was finally telling the truth after years of swallowing my hurt and disappointment. You know what the saddest part is? I continued, my voice quieter now, but no less intense. I kept coming back here, hoping that someday you'd see me, really see me. Not as the child who wasn't Bruce, but as Margaret, as someone with value in her own right. My mother's eyes were filling with tears, but whether they were tears of guilt or frustration, I couldn't tell. I thought if I just tried hard enough, if I was successful enough in my own way, if I was helpful enough and present enough and loving enough, eventually you'd realize that I was worth loving too. We do love you, my mother whispered. No, you don't. You love the idea of having a daughter, but you don't love me. You love Bruce. You're proud of Bruce. You enjoy Bruce's company. I'm just the obligation you fulfill every week when I show up for dinner. The truth of those words hit everyone at the table like a physical force. Sandra looked stricken. Bruce looked guilty. My parents looked shocked, as if they'd never considered that their behavior might be perceived that way. That's when my father made the mistake that changed everything. You know what, Margaret, he said, his voice rising with anger. Maybe we would be prouder of you if you gave us more to be proud of. Maybe if you stopped feeling sorry for yourself and actually accomplished something meaningful, we'd have a different relationship. Frank, my mother warned, but he was just getting started. I'm tired of walking on eggshells around your feelings. Bruce doesn't need constant validation because he's secure in his achievements. He doesn't blame us for his problems because he takes responsibility for his own life. Each word was like a hammer blow, but I stood there and took it, feeling something hard and cold crystallizing in my chest. You want to know the truth? My father continued, apparently interpreting my silence as submission. Sometimes I wish you were never born. The words hit the air like a physical slap. My mother gasped. Sandra's hand flew to her mouth. Bruce said, "Dad, no." But my father wasn't finished. "We wish you were never born. Life would be so much simpler without all your drama and your constant need for attention." My mother, instead of contradicting him, nodded slowly. "Maybe that's harsh, but sometimes, yes, sometimes I wish things were different." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, marking the seconds as 28 years of hope died inside me. And then something remarkable happened. Instead of collapsing, instead of crying, instead of begging them to take it back, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. The pretense was finally over. The truth was finally out. They'd said what they really felt, and now I was free to respond accordingly. I straightened my shoulders, wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, and looked directly at my parents. "Perfect," I said, my voice steady and calm. "Then you won't need me when you're old." The effect of my words was immediate and electric. My father's face went from angry red to pale white in the span of 3 seconds. My mother's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Sandra gripped Bruce's arm so tightly that he winced. "Maggie, wait," Bruce said, using my childhood nickname for the first time in years. Dad didn't mean that. He was angry. "Oh, he meant it," I replied, surprised by how calm I sounded. "And you know what? He's absolutely right. Life would be simpler. Simpler for you to call Bruce when you need rides to doctor appointments. Simpler for you to ask Sandra to help with groceries when you can't drive anymore. Simpler for you to figure out your medications without a registered nurse in the family." I moved around the table, slowly speaking directly to each of them. "It'll be simpler for you to find someone else to explain insurance paperwork when you're confused. Simpler to find a different person to stay with you during medical procedures when you're scared. Simpler to call someone else at 2 a.m. when you think you're having a heart attack." "Margaret, stop," my mother said, tears streaming down her face now. "You're being vindictive. I'm being honest. Just like you were honest about wishing I was never born." I looked directly at her. "Do you remember when you had that kidney stone last year? You called me crying because the pain was so bad you couldn't think straight. I came over immediately, drove you to the emergency room, and stayed with you for 8 hours until they got your pain under control." She nodded, unable to speak. "I held your hand while they put in the IV. I explained every procedure to you in terms you could understand. I advocated for you with the medical staff when they wanted to discharge you too early. I brought you home and stayed the night to make sure you were okay." "Yes, you did," she whispered. "And the whole time I was thinking about how glad I was that I could be there for you. How grateful I was that my medical knowledge could help someone I loved feel less scared and more informed." I paused, letting that sink in. "But according to what you just said, you wish that person had never been born." My father tried to interject. "Margaret, you're taking this too far." "Am I, because I'm just following your logic to its natural conclusion?" I turned to face him fully. "Remember 6 months ago when you were worried about those chest pains? You didn't want to bother Bruce because he was busy with his promotion. So you called me. I came over, took your vital signs, asked you detailed questions about your symptoms, and convinced you to let me drive you to get an EKG." His face was gray now, and he was gripping the edge of the table. "It turned out to be nothing serious, just stress and indigestion. But I stayed with you through all the tests because I could see how frightened you were. I explained the results to you and Mom in terms you could understand. I helped you make follow-up appointments and set up a system for monitoring your blood pressure at home." "I remember," he said quietly. "That was the daughter you wish had never been born. The one who dropped everything to make sure you were okay. The one who used her professional knowledge to help keep you healthy and informed." I let that sit for a moment. "So you're right. Life will be much simpler without all that." Sandra was crying now too, and Bruce looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. I've spent 28 years trying to earn love that you freely give to Bruce. I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. I've sacrificed my time, my energy, my peace of mind for this family. I've rearranged my schedule around your needs, celebrated your achievements, and supported you through difficulties. You have, my mother admitted through her tears. But you're right. You don't need me. And you know what, I don't need this anymore either. I walked to the kitchen counter where I'd left my purse and keys. When I turned back around, they were all staring at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Fear, panic, the dawning realization that they might have pushed too far. Margaret, let's talk about this rationally. My father said, his voice taking on a pleading tone I'd never heard from him. We're past talking, Dad. You said what you really think. You wish I'd never been born. Well, congratulations. As of right now, you got your wish. What do you mean? My mother asked, though I could tell she already knew. I mean, I'm done. Done with these dinners where I'm criticized and compared to Bruce. Done with phone calls where you barely listen to what I'm saying. Done with being treated like a disappointment and an obligation. I slung my purse over my shoulder and picked up my keys. I'm going to change my phone number tomorrow. I won't be coming to any more family gatherings. You won't receive birthday or Christmas gifts from me anymore. When you need medical advice or help navigating healthcare decisions, you'll have to figure it out yourselves or ask Bruce. You can't be serious, Bruce said, standing up from his chair. I'm completely serious. You wanted life without me. You got it. My mother was sobbing now. Margaret, please. We said things we didn't mean. No, Mom. You said things you did mean but never intended to say out loud. There's a difference. I walked toward the front door but turned back for one final statement. For 28 years, I've been trying to be the daughter you wanted. Starting tomorrow, you get to find out what life is like without the daughter you actually had. And with that, I walked out of my childhood home for the last time. The first few days after I left that dinner were surreal. I sat in my apartment Tuesday night staring at my phone and waiting for someone to call. Part of me expected my mother to reach out with an apology or Bruce to try to mediate. But my phone stayed silent. Wednesday morning, I followed through on my promise and changed my phone number. The woman at the cellular store asked if I wanted to keep the same number and just change carriers, but I told her I needed a completely new number. She looked at me curiously but processed the change without questions. That afternoon, I created new email addresses and changed my contact information at work, at my bank, and with my landlord. I was methodical about it, making sure there was no way for my family to reach me through any of the usual channels. By Thursday, I realized they were trying to contact me. When I arrived at work for my evening shift, the charge nurse told me someone named Bruce had called asking for me. I instructed her to tell anyone from my family that I wasn't available and couldn't receive personal calls during work hours. Friday brought flowers to my apartment building. The delivery person buzzed my unit, and when I saw Patricia Henderson on the card through the window, I refused the delivery. I watched from my second-floor window as the confused delivery man carried the large arrangement back to his van. The hardest part wasn't missing my family. It was breaking the habits I'd built around them. Sunday morning came and I automatically reached for my phone to make my weekly call before remembering that chapter of my life was over. Instead, I made myself coffee and sat on my small balcony reading a book I'd been meaning to finish for months. For the first time in years, I had an entire weekend to myself. No family obligations, no guilt about missing dinners or phone calls, no anxiety about whether I'd say something that would trigger criticism. It was strange, but also liberating. I threw myself into work with renewed energy. Without the emotional drain of weekly family interactions, I found myself more focused and present with my patients. I signed up for additional training sessions and started mentoring newer nurses. My supervisor noticed the change and commented on my improved attitude and increased engagement. 3 weeks after the dinner, Bruce showed up at the hospital. I was coming off my shift when I saw him in the parking garage, leaning against his SUV next to my car. My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to walk calmly toward him. "We need to talk," he said when I got close enough to hear him. "No, we don't," I replied, unlocking my car door. "Maggie, please. Mom and Dad are a mess. They didn't mean what they said." I turned to face him fully. "Bruce, they said they wished I'd never been born. What part of that was unclear?" "They were angry. People say stupid things when they're angry." "Do they?" "Because I've been angry plenty of times, and I've never told anyone I wish they'd never existed." I opened my car door. "That's not something you say accidentally." "They regret it," he insisted. "Mom has been crying every day. Dad barely speaks to anyone." "That's unfortunate for them," I said, getting into my car. "But it's not my problem anymore." He put his hand on my car door to prevent me from closing it. "You're my sister. You can't just disappear from our lives. Watch me." I gently but firmly moved his hand and closed the door. Through the window I could see him standing there looking lost and confused. As I drove away, I felt a pang of sadness for the relationship we might have had if our parents hadn't always positioned us as competitors instead of siblings. A month later, my landlord told me someone had been asking about me. A woman matching my mother's description had come to the building twice asking which unit I lived in. He'd refused to give out that information, but it made me realize I needed to take additional steps to protect my privacy. I started parking in a different section of the hospital parking garage and varying my schedule when possible. I asked my closest work friends not to share any information about me with people who might be family members. It felt paranoid, but I knew my parents well enough to know they wouldn't give up easily. The hardest moment came 6 weeks after our final dinner. I was grocery shopping when I saw my mother in the produce section of the store. She looked terrible, thin and tired, with dark circles under her eyes. For a moment my resolve wavered. This was the woman who had raised me, who had bandaged my scraped knees and taught me to drive. But then I remembered her nodding along when my father said they wished I'd never been born. I remembered years of criticism and comparison, of feeling invisible and undervalued in my own family. I turned my cart around and left the store without buying anything. 3 months in, I realized I was genuinely happier. The constant low-level anxiety I'd carried for years was gone. I wasn't dreading Sunday phone calls or Tuesday dinners. I wasn't second-guessing myself constantly or trying to anticipate criticism. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself instead of trying to earn approval that was never going to come. I started dating again, something I'd put on the back burner while dealing with family stress. I joined a book club and a hiking group. I took a pottery class and discovered I had a talent for it. I was building a life based on my own interests and values, not on what might finally make my parents proud. The turning point came 4 months after I'd walked out of their house. My friend Linda, who worked in the cardiac unit, mentioned that a man named Frank Henderson had been admitted with chest pains. She knew it was a common name and might not be related to me, but thought I should know. My first instinct was to rush to the cardiac unit and check on him. My medical training kicked in, and I found myself mentally reviewing cardiac protocols and thinking about what questions I'd want to ask his doctors. But then I remembered he wasn't my responsibility anymore. He'd made it clear that my knowledge and caring weren't wanted or needed. I thanked Linda for the information and went about my shift. Later, I learned through hospital gossip that he'd been discharged after 2 days with a diagnosis of anxiety-related chest pain. The irony wasn't lost on me that the stress of our family situation had literally given him heart problems. 9 months after walking out of that family dinner, I was a different person. Not dramatically different, but settled in a way I'd never been before. I'd moved to a new apartment in a neighborhood I loved, closer to downtown and walking distance from several restaurants and shops. I'd adopted a rescue cat named Oliver, who seemed to understand that we were both starting over. My job had become even more fulfilling without the constant emotional drain of family stress. I'd been promoted to senior nurse and was being considered for a leadership position in the emergency department. My colleagues respected my skills and judgment, and I'd been asked to present at a regional conference about trauma care protocols. I'd also started dating someone I really liked. Dr. James Murphy was a physician in the emergency department who'd asked me out for coffee after we'd worked together on a particularly difficult case. He was kind, intelligent, and treated me as an equal partner in patient care. When he talked about my work, it was with respect and admiration, not dismissal or suggestions for improvement. The relationship was still new, but it was teaching me what it felt like to be valued for who I was rather than criticized for who I wasn't. James listened when I talked about my work, asked thoughtful questions about my experiences, and celebrated my professional achievements. It was a revelation to realize that this was how healthy relationships were supposed to function. I'd also built a chosen family of friends who genuinely cared about me. Linda from the cardiac unit had become a close friend, and we had dinner together twice a week. Sarah from my hiking group had invited me to spend Thanksgiving with her family when she learned I'd be alone. Marcus from my book club and I had started a tradition of trying new restaurants together once a month. These relationships were based on mutual respect and genuine affection, not obligation or blood relation. When I accomplished something at work, they celebrated with me. When I was having a difficult day, they offered support without judgment. When I shared my thoughts and feelings, they listened without trying to fix me or change me. The contrast with my biological family was stark. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be truly accepted. I'd heard updates about my family through the hospital grapevine. My father had been treated for anxiety and had started seeing a therapist. My mother had apparently been asking mutual acquaintances if they'd seen me always describing herself as worried about my well-being. Bruce had been promoted to the management position he'd wanted, but according to someone who knew Sandra, the stress of the family situation had put strain on their marriage. Part of me felt sad about their struggles, but I reminded myself that these were consequences of their own choices. They'd created this situation with their words and actions. They were dealing with the results of treating one child as valuable and the other as disposable. The real test of my resolve came when I received an unexpected visitor at work. It was a Tuesday evening in late fall, when the security guard at the emergency department entrance called to tell me someone was asking for me. When I went to the front desk, I found Sandra standing there looking nervous and uncomfortable. "Margaret, I know you don't want to see any of us," she began, "but I'm here about something important." I considered walking away, but something in her expression made me pause. "What is it?" "Your mom is in the hospital. Valley General not here. She had a stroke yesterday." The words hit me like a physical blow. Despite everything that had happened, despite the months of separation and anger, my mother was still my mother. My medical training immediately kicked in, and I found myself asking questions about her condition, her treatment, her prognosis. "She's stable," Sandra said quickly. "But it was significant. She's having trouble with speech and movement on her left side. Your dad is with her, but he's not handling it well. He keeps asking the nurses questions they can't answer, and he's getting frustrated because he doesn't understand the medical terminology." I could picture it perfectly. My father's scared and confused trying to navigate a healthcare system he didn't understand, struggling to advocate for his wife without the medical knowledge to ask the right questions or interpret the answers he received. "Bruce is trying to help," Sandra continued, "but he doesn't know anything about medical stuff either. We keep thinking about how you would know what questions to ask, what the doctors really mean when they use technical terms." It was a masterful appeal, and Sandra was smart enough to frame it in terms of my expertise rather than my family obligation. She was acknowledging that I possessed knowledge and skills they needed, rather than simply demanding that I show up because I was related to them. "I'm sorry this happened," I said carefully, "but I'm not part of your family anymore. Remember," Sandra's eyes filled with tears, "Margaret, I know what they said was awful. I know they hurt you in ways that can't be easily forgiven. But this is different. This is about whether your mom gets the best possible care and support during her recovery." She was right, and she knew it. This wasn't about family loyalty or forgiveness or reconciliation. This was about my professional knowledge and personal integrity. Could I stand by and let my mother receive substandard care because I was angry at my parents? "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I said finally. "Could you just talk to her doctors, not as her daughter, but as a medical professional? Help us understand what we're dealing with and what questions we should be asking." It was a reasonable request, framed in a way that respected my boundaries while acknowledging my expertise. Sandra had clearly thought this through carefully. I stood there for a long moment weighing my options. I could maintain my boundaries and refuse to get involved. I could compromise those boundaries and risk being drawn back into family drama. Or I could find a middle path that honored both my professional ethics and my personal limits. "I'll make one phone call," I said finally. "To her attending physician. I'll ask for a clinical summary of her condition and treatment plan. Then I'll explain it to you and your family in terms you can understand. That's it. One phone call, one explanation, and then I'm done." Sandra nodded eagerly. "That would help so much. Thank you. But I want to be clear about something," I continued. "This doesn't change anything between me and my parents. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do medically, not because I'm ready to reconcile or forgive." "I understand," she said quietly. I made the phone call that night after my shift ended. Dr. Rodriguez, my mother's neurologist, was professional and thorough in explaining her condition. She'd suffered what he classified as a moderate ischemic stroke affecting the left side of her brain. Her speech and motor functions were impacted, but there was reason for optimism about recovery with proper rehabilitation. The next morning I met Sandra at a coffee shop near the hospital and spent an hour explaining everything Dr. Rodriguez had told me. I translated the medical terminology into plain English, outlined the expected recovery timeline, and provided a list of questions they should ask about rehabilitation options and follow-up care. "Will you come see her?" Sandra asked, as we were getting ready to leave. "No," I said firmly. "I've done what I can do professionally. The rest is up to you and the medical team." Sandra looked like she wanted to argue, but she simply nodded and thanked me for my help. 3 days later, I received a handwritten letter at my apartment. The envelope had my mother's shaky handwriting on it, clearly written with her non-dominant hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few words. "Thank you for helping even when we didn't deserve it. I'm sorry for everything. I love you." I read the letter 3 times, then put it in a drawer. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. Words on paper couldn't undo 28 years of feeling second best. An apology written from a hospital bed couldn't erase the damage of being told I should never have been born. But it was something. For the first time since that horrible dinner, one of my parents had acknowledged that they'd been wrong and that I'd been wronged. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd ever received from them before. I didn't respond to the letter, but I didn't throw it away either. I left it in the drawer, a small symbol of possibility in a relationship that might someday be repairable, though it would never be the same. What I'd learned over those 9 months was that I didn't need their approval to have value. I didn't need their love to be worthy of love. I'd built a life filled with meaningful work, genuine friendships, and the kind of respect I'd always craved from my family. Sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away. And sometimes the family that matters most is the one you choose for yourself. I'd chosen to surround myself with people who saw my worth, who celebrated my achievements, and who treated me with the kindness and respect every person deserves. For the first time in my life, I was enough exactly as I was. And that realization was worth more than any apology or attempt at reconciliation could ever be. I'd walked away from a family that made me feel small and worthless, and I'd walked into a life where I could finally see my own value clearly. That wasn't just healing, it was transformation. That wasn't just survival, it was victory. And as I sat in my new apartment that night with Oliver purring in my lap, and a text from James asking about my day, I knew I'd made the right choice. Sometimes you have to lose everything to realize you never really had it in the first place. And sometimes you have to walk away from the people who don't value you to find the ones who do. I'd wished for my parents' love for 28 years. Now I understood that their love, conditional and critical as it was, had never been what I actually needed. What I'd needed was to love and value myself enough to walk away from people who couldn't see my worth. That lesson was painful to learn, but it was the most important thing I'd ever discovered. And no one could ever take that knowledge away from me. Have you ever had to walk away from family members who didn't treat you with respect? How did you find the courage to put yourself first? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, please give this video a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about setting boundaries and finding your self-worth. Share this with someone who might need to hear that they deserve better than conditional love. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that you are valuable exactly as you are. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us most are the ones who see us least clearly. But that doesn't mean we have to accept their version of who we are. I hope wherever you are in your own journey, you find the strength to surround yourself with people who celebrate you instead of constantly trying to change you. You deserve nothing less than genuine love and respect. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.